Imagine an ancient ship sailing across time itself. Wooden planks, weathered by the ocean, are replaced one by one. Eventually, not a single original piece remains, and yet the captain and crew consider it to be the same ship. But is it? Or has something else taken its place? This is the ship of Theseus Paradox, a thought experiment first recorded by the Greek historian Plutarch nearly 2,000 years ago. It asks a simple yet deeply unsettling question. If you replace every part of an object, does it remain the same thing? Consider this. If every plank, mast, and rope of the ship of Theseus was gradually replaced, is it still the same ship, or is it now something else entirely? And at what point does it cease to be the ship of Theseus? After half the parts are replaced, 3/4, or only when the last original piece is gone? Now, take this further. If all the discarded pieces were gathered and reassembled into a second ship, one that is identical to the original in every way, then which is the real ship of Theseus? The one that was slowly rebuilt, or the one that was reconstructed from its former self? That was the chilling twist that philosopher Thomas Hobbes introduced. If every old part of the ship is reassembled elsewhere, which is the real one? Could this mean that our sense of self is nothing more than an illusion of continuity? And this question isn't just theoretical. It haunts us in ways we might not even realize. Think about a beloved childhood toy that's been repaired over the years. Does it still hold the same magic? What about an old house, slowly renovated beyond recognition? Or even the way technology reconstructs our digital selves, data fragmented, replaced, reassembled. Are we the sum of our parts, or something deeper? Another philosopher, John Locke, suggested that identity is tied to memory. If you remember your past, you are still you. The ship of Theseus's paradox strikes at the core of identity and continuity, not just for objects, but for people. Every cell in your body is replaced over time. The thoughts you had as a child, faded memories, the habits, the fears, the dreams, they change. Are you still the same person you were years ago? Or have you become someone entirely new? Some argue that identity isn't about physical components at all, but rather the persistence of function, purpose, or essence. A river remains the same river, even as the water within it constantly changes. Does the same apply to us? And what about cities, cultures, civilizations? A city's skyline changes, old buildings are demolished, new ones rise. Traditions evolve, languages shift, and generations bring new ideas. Is Paris still the same city it was 100 years ago? Is Rome? If you take away every physical piece, every custom, every belief, at what point does it stop being what it was? Or does the essence of a place, much like a person, persist beyond the sum of its parts? There is no final answer, no singular truth. The ship of Theseus floats in the endless waters of philosophy, a ghost ship of shifting identity. But perhaps the real horror isn't the ship itself, but the realization that we, too, are constantly being rebuilt. And one day, we may not even recognize what we've become. So tell me, are you still the same person who started listening to this? Imagine someone walks up to you and says, "I am lying." A simple statement, yet one that unravels into an inescapable contradiction. If the person is telling the truth, then they must be lying, just as they claimed. But if they are lying, then their statement must be false, meaning they are actually telling the truth. The mind loops endlessly, unable to resolve the contradiction. This is the liar paradox. one of the most famous and perplexing logical dilemmas in philosophy. It dates back to the ancient Greek philosopher Eubulides, the same thinker who proposed the Sorites Paradox. At its core, the liar paradox is a self-referential problem, a statement that contradicts itself in a way that logic struggles to resolve. Variations of the paradox appear throughout history. One famous example is the Epimenides Paradox, in which Epimenides, a Cretan philosopher, supposedly stated, "All Cretans are liars." If this is true, then as a Cretan himself, Epimenides must also be a liar, meaning his statement is false. But if his statement is false, then not all Cretans are liars, meaning he might be telling the truth. The contradiction remains unresolved. The paradox highlights a fundamental issue in logic and language: self-reference and truth-value cycles. Normally we assume that statements are either true or false, but the liar paradox challenges this binary thinking. It presents a statement that cannot neatly fit into either category. If truth and falsehood cannot fully contain it, what does that say about the nature of logic itself? Philosophers and logicians have proposed various resolutions. Some suggest that truth and falsity are not always absolute, that certain statements exist in a gray area outside of conventional logic. Others argue that self-referential statements should be excluded from logical systems altogether, much like how mathematical frameworks sometimes limit self-reference to avoid paradoxes. Another approach involves para-consistent logic, a system that allows contradictions to exist without collapsing into complete incoherence. In this view, a statement can be both true and false simultaneously under certain conditions. This idea may seem counterintuitive, but it reflects real-world complexities, such as quantum mechanics, where particles can exist in multiple states at once. Beyond logic, the liar paradox raises unsettling questions about language, meaning, and even human perception. If we struggle to define something as basic as truth in a single sentence, what does that say about our ability to define larger, more abstract concepts? Could entire belief systems or ideologies contain similar contradictions, hidden beneath layers of reasoning? The paradox also extends to artificial intelligence and self-referential systems. If an AI were programmed to evaluate the truth of a statement like, "This sentence is false," how should it respond? Could it be caught in an infinite loop, just as human logic is? As we develop more advanced reasoning systems, understanding and addressing self-referential paradoxes becomes increasingly important. Perhaps the most haunting implication of the liar paradox is its reflection on human cognition. We like to believe that logic provides a firm foundation for understanding reality, but the paradox suggests that even our most fundamental concepts, truth and falsehood, might not be as solid as we assume. If something as simple as a sentence can dismantle the binary of true and false, what other contradictions lie hidden in the structure of our thinking? In the end, the liar paradox remains an unsolved riddle, a statement that forces us to confront the limitations of our reasoning. It is a paradox without resolution, a loop without escape, one that whispers to us in its eternal contradiction that perhaps some truths are simply beyond our grasp. Imagine a city plagued by traffic. Every morning, thousands of commuters navigate its streets, each trying to find the fastest route to work. The city planners, eager to solve the congestion, unveil a brand new road, a shortcut designed to streamline traffic and reduce travel times. But then something strange happens. Instead of improving the situation, traffic gets worse. Commutes take longer. Frustration rises. The very road that was meant to be a solution has become a curse. How could this be? This is Braess Paradox, a counterintuitive principle in network theory, first proposed by mathematician Dietrich Braess in 1968. It suggests that in a congested network, adding an extra route can increase overall travel time, the very opposite of what we expect. To understand this paradox, let's break it down. Imagine 4 locations forming a square, 2 residential areas on the left, 2 workplace hubs on the right. Between them are 2 main roads, one across the top, one across the bottom, each taking 45 minutes to traverse under normal conditions. To ease congestion, a new, ultra-fast shortcut appears, connecting the middle of the top and bottom roads with near-instantaneous travel. Logically, this should be a game changer. But here's where human behavior enters the equation. Every commuter seeks to minimize their own travel time. Now, instead of using just the 2 original roads, they all rush to exploit the new shortcut. More drivers funnel into the shortcut, clogging it. The roads leading into it become congested, slowing everyone down. The traffic disperses inefficiently, and the total travel time for everyone increases. If the new road were removed, the balance would be restored. Yet no single driver would ever choose to abandon the shortcut voluntarily. The paradox exposes a fundamental flaw in how we intuitively approach efficiency. What benefits an individual does not always benefit the system as a whole. It's the tragedy of self-interest manifesting in the asphalt arteries of a city. But this principle extends far beyond traffic. It's a haunting reminder that sometimes adding more choice makes things worse. Take the internet. When websites and servers are connected by additional high-speed links, it might seem like traffic should flow better. But if users all reroute to the new, seemingly optimal path, congestion spikes and speeds drop for everyone. A system designed to be faster ends up grinding to a halt. Or consider economics. A company increases its product variety, believing that giving customers more options will boost sales. But paradoxically, too many choices overwhelm consumers, leading to decision paralysis, where people avoid making a choice altogether. Even in psychology, the paradox plays out. The more ways we have to connect, social media, messaging apps, endless communication tools, the lonelier and more fragmented people can feel. More roads to connection don't always lead to better relationships. And what about human civilization itself? We expand, build, innovate, always believing that more is progress. But is it? The more we industrialize, the more we consume, the more we extract from the earth. Sometimes, our very efforts to improve the world accelerate its decline. Braess Paradox is not just about traffic. It is about the hidden costs of optimization, about the dangers of pursuing individual gain in a shared system. It's about how more is not always better, and how sometimes the best solution is not to add, but to take away. So tell me, the next time you find yourself in gridlock, staring at that shortcut you thought would save you time, will you still take it? Or will you see the paradox at play? In a small isolated town, there lives a barber with a simple yet absolute rule. He shaves every man in town who does not shave himself, and only those men. The rule is clear, logical, until you ask the one question that unravels everything. Who shaves the barber? This is the Barber Paradox, a logical paradox proposed by the mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell. At first glance, it seems like nothing more than a peculiar riddle, but at its heart lies a contradiction so deep that it challenges the very foundations of logic itself. Let's break it down. The barber shaves all men who do not shave themselves. If the barber does shave himself, he violates the rule, because he only shaves those who do not shave themselves. But if he doesn't shave himself, then he must be one of the men who needs shaving, so the barber must shave him. But wait, if he does shave himself, then he shouldn't be shaving himself. The paradox loops in on itself, an inescapable contradiction. This isn't just wordplay. It's a glimpse into the dangers of self-referential logic, rules that include themselves in their own definitions. The Barber Paradox helped expose fundamental issues within set theory, the very foundation of mathematics. It led Russell to discover what's now called Russell's paradox, a problem that shook early 20th century logic and forced mathematicians to rethink the way they structured logical systems. But beyond math, the paradox raises disturbing philosophical questions. How do we define rules that apply to themselves? Can any system, no matter how seemingly perfect, collapse under the weight of its own logic? Consider language. Can a sentence declare itself false? This statement is false. If it's true, then it must be false. But if it's false, then it must be true. Just like the barber, it folds in on itself, a contradiction that defies resolution, or take artificial intelligence. Imagine an AI designed to follow only a specific set of rules. What happens if it encounters a situation where every possible decision violates its programming? Can logic alone dictate reality, or does it break down when turned inward? Even in human existence, we encounter versions of this paradox. Are we truly free if we are bound by rules we ourselves create? If society dictates laws, but those laws must also govern the very lawmakers who create them, does authority ultimately contradict itself? And on a personal level, can we be the authors of our own identity if that identity is shaped by the very experiences we create? And what about trust? If someone says, "I always lie," do you believe them? If they're telling the truth, then they must be lying. But if they're lying, then perhaps they're telling the truth. Just like the barber, the contradiction is inescapable. We live in a world of systems, laws, logic, language, identity. But what happens when a system turns inward, when the rules try to define themselves? Perhaps the real horror of the Barber Paradox is the realization that even logic, the foundation of certainty, has cracks. So tell me, if you lived in that town, would you let the barber shave you? Or would you be trapped in the paradox forever? Imagine you step into a time machine and travel back several decades. You walk the streets of a world before your birth, unnoticed, invisible in history. Then you make a fateful decision. You seek out your own grandfather before he ever had children, and somehow you prevent him from meeting your grandmother. Maybe you convince him to move away. Maybe you sabotage their first meeting, or maybe something more drastic happens. The question is, what happens to you? This is the Grandfather Paradox, one of the most famous time travel paradoxes. It explores a logical contradiction. If you were never born because your grandfather never had children, then you were never able to travel back in time to prevent his meeting your grandmother. But if you never traveled back in time, then your grandfather did have children, which means you were born. and could travel back in time to stop it. The timeline twists into a self-contradictory loop. At its core, the Grandfather Paradox highlights a fundamental problem with time travel: causality. We understand reality in a cause and effect structure. One event leads to another. But if an event causes itself to be negated, we enter a paradoxical state where neither outcome can logically exist. Some theories suggest a resolution. Perhaps reality simply doesn't allow such paradoxes. In what's called the Novikov self-consistency principle, time travel is possible, but history is unchangeable. If you attempt to alter the past, something will always prevent you. Your gun jams, your grandfather miraculously avoids danger, or fate conspires against you in ways beyond control. The timeline protects itself from contradictions. Another possible resolution is the many worlds interpretation. Instead of changing your past, your interference creates a branching timeline. A parallel universe where your grandfather never has children, but in your original universe, history remains unchanged. In this view, every time a paradox would occur, the universe simply splits, creating an alternate version of events. But the paradox runs deeper than just time travel. It forces us to question the very nature of identity and existence. If the past can be changed, does it mean our existence is constantly in flux? Are we only real because the past happened in just the right way? And if history can be rewritten, is there ever a single true version of reality? Beyond time travel, the Grandfather Paradox reflects broader philosophical and scientific dilemmas. Consider genetics and lineage, how small changes in history could lead to vastly different outcomes. If a distant ancestor made even a minor decision differently, would an entirely different person have been born in your place? In a way, we all live within the delicate balance of a timeline shaped by countless unpredictable factors. The paradox also has implications for physics and the nature of time itself. Some physicists suggest that time isn't a single linear thread, but a complex, interconnected web, where past, present, and future might all exist simultaneously. If so, then the question isn't just whether you can change the past. It's whether the past is something that can truly be changed at all. Perhaps the most unsettling question the Grandfather Paradox raises is this: if time is flexible, is reality itself just an illusion? Are we merely the products of a delicate, unbroken chain of events? One that, if disturbed, might erase us entirely? Or is existence more resilient than we think, capable of rewriting itself in ways we've yet to understand? In the end, the Grandfather Paradox remains one of the most tantalizing puzzles of time travel, a thought experiment that forces us to confront not just the limits of physics, but the very foundations of our own existence. Whether time is a rigid path or an ever-branching tree, one thing remains certain: the past, present, and future are more intertwined than we may ever fully grasp. Imagine you hold a perfect sphere in your hands, a smooth, solid object, as real as any other. Now imagine slicing it apart into several pieces, not by cutting in any ordinary way, but by dividing it into sets of infinitely complex points, carefully selected in a way that defies intuition. Then, with nothing but rotation and movement, no stretching, no adding material, you reassemble these pieces into two identical spheres, each exactly the same size as the original. It sounds like magic. It sounds like madness. But this is the Banach-Tarski paradox, a theorem in mathematics that suggests Under the right conditions, you can take one sphere and duplicate it into two without violating any mathematical laws. To understand how this is possible, we need to venture into the world of infinite sets and non-measurable objects, concepts that challenge the very way we define reality. At its core, the paradox is built on the foundations of set theory, particularly the axiom of choice, a principle in mathematics that allows for the selection of elements from an infinite collection of sets in a way that is not explicitly defined. Using this axiom, mathematicians Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski proved in 1924 that a solid three-dimensional object could be decomposed into a finite number of disjoint sets, which, when reassembled through rigid motions alone, form two identical copies of the original object. But here's where it gets truly unsettling. This isn't just a thought experiment confined to the abstract world of mathematics. The Banach-Tarski paradox suggests that, in theory, a single grain of dust could be split and reassembled into a planet-sized object, or that the entire mass of the universe could be doubled with the right transformation. Of course, in physical reality, this isn't possible. The paradox relies on infinitely precise, non-measurable sets, which do not exist in the tangible world. Atoms, molecules, and matter itself have physical constraints that prevent this bizarre duplication. But in the realm of pure mathematics, where infinity reigns supreme, the paradox holds true. This raises profound philosophical questions about the nature of space, matter, and identity. If something can be deconstructed and reconstructed into two identical copies, what does it mean to be the original? If an object can be perfectly duplicated, does uniqueness have any meaning at all? It also forces us to reconsider our understanding of division and conservation. We instinctively believe that splitting something means reducing it, that breaking a whole results in smaller parts. But Banach-Tarski shows us that, at least mathematically, breaking something can create more than what we started with. And what about us? Human beings, like the sphere in this paradox, are collections of memories, cells, and experiences. Over time, every cell in our body is replaced, yet we still believe we are the same person. But if our essence could be mathematically divided and reassembled, would we remain ourselves? Or would we become something or someone entirely new? Even our civilizations mirror this paradox. Cities grow, shift, and are rebuilt. Cultures fragment, evolve, and reassemble in ways that make them unrecognizable from their origins. At what point does a city cease to be the city it once was? When does a culture stop being its former self and become something new? The Banach-Tarski paradox is a testament to the strange, unsettling beauty of mathematics. It reminds us that even in the realm of logic and numbers, contradictions lurk beneath the surface, waiting to upend our understanding of reality. So tell me, if you could take a part of yourself, duplicate it, and become twice what you were before, would you? A prisoner sits in his cell, awaiting his fate. The judge has just declared his sentence. You will be hanged at noon on one weekday next week. But the exact day will be a surprise. You will not know the day of your execution until the executioner arrives at your cell that morning. The prisoner, though terrified, is also a logician. He begins to reason. If the execution were to take place on Friday, I would know by Thursday night that it must happen the next day, since it hasn't happened earlier in the week. But the judge said it must be a surprise, meaning it can't be Friday. That rules out Friday entirely. Now, if Friday is impossible, then Thursday must also be impossible. If I reach Wednesday night and haven't been hanged, I'll know it has to be Thursday. But that wouldn't be a surprise either. So Thursday is ruled out too. Applying the same reasoning, Wednesday, Tuesday, and even Monday must all be impossible. There is no possible day on which I can be hanged as a surprise. I have outwitted the judge. Satisfied with his logic, the prisoner rests easy. But then on a random morning, perhaps a Wednesday, the guards arrive, pull him from his cell, and prepare the noose. He is shocked. The execution is, in fact, a complete surprise. Thus we arrive at the unexpected hanging paradox, a perplexing contradiction in logic and self-reference. The prisoner's reasoning seemed flawless, yet he was still caught off guard. So where did he go wrong? This paradox, first formulated in the 1940s, has puzzled logicians and philosophers for decades. It challenges our very understanding of prediction, expectation, and reasoning about the future. At its core, the paradox arises from self-referential logic. The prisoner's conclusion that he cannot be hanged relies on the judge's statement being entirely true. But if the executioner does surprise him, then the assumption behind his reasoning collapses. But this paradox isn't just about hangings. It sneaks into various aspects of logic, probability, and even everyday decision-making. Think about financial markets. Investors often try to predict economic downturns, believing that if a crash is foreseeable, they can adjust their investments in advance. But if everyone anticipates and reacts to an expected crash, their actions might prevent it or cause it sooner in unexpected ways. Or consider military strategy. If an army expects a surprise attack, it prepares accordingly. But if it's prepared, can the attack truly be a surprise? Strategists must constantly weigh expectation against deception. Even in psychology, we see this paradox manifest. If someone tells you, you'll feel an unexpected rush of joy this week, the very expectation of that surprise moment can undermine its unexpected nature. Anticipation alters the experience itself. But perhaps the most unsettling implication of the unexpected hanging paradox lies in its challenge to human certainty. We often think we can reason through all possible outcomes, outmaneuver fate, and prepare for any eventuality. Yet time and time again, we are surprised by events we thought impossible, by futures we had ruled out, by twists we never saw coming. So ask yourself, how many things have you convinced yourself cannot happen? And when the moment arrives, will you truly see it coming? Or will you, like the prisoner, stare in disbelief as the executioner opens the door? Imagine standing at the edge of an island, tasked with measuring its coastline. You pull out a map and a ruler, tracing the outline carefully. After some calculations, you determine the island's perimeter. But what if you used a more detailed map? The coastline appears jagged, full of inlets and tiny curves that weren't visible before. The more closely you examine it, the longer the coastline seems to become. This is the Coastline Paradox, a fascinating and counterintuitive idea in mathematics and geography. It states that the length of a coastline depends on the scale at which you measure it. The closer you look, the longer it appears, potentially to infinity. The paradox was formally introduced by mathematician Louis Fry Richardson in the early 20th century. He noticed that different countries reported vastly different measurements for their coastlines, depending on the methods and units used. When measuring with broad, straight-line segments, coastlines seemed shorter. When measured with smaller, more detailed segments, the lengths grew dramatically. There was no single, true length of a coastline, only an ever-increasing approximation. But why does this happen? The answer lies in fractal geometry, a concept later explored by Benoit Mandelbrot. Coastlines, much like clouds or mountain ranges, exhibit self-similarity, meaning that no matter how closely you zoom in, smaller and smaller details emerge, each contributing to the overall length. Mandelbrot suggested that coastlines could be considered fractals, mathematical structures that don't conform to traditional Euclidean dimensions. To illustrate the effect, imagine measuring a coastline with a 100-kilometer ruler. You might approximate its length at, say, 2,000 kilometers. Now use a 10-kilometer ruler, capturing more of the curves and indentations. The length increases, perhaps to 2,500 kilometers. Shrink the ruler further to 1 kilometer, and the coastline grows again. This pattern continues indefinitely. If you were to measure each tiny grain of sand along the shore, the length could theoretically stretch to infinity. The implications of this paradox extend far beyond geography. It challenges our fundamental assumptions about measurement, scale, and even reality itself. In physics, the paradox raises questions about the nature of space. If we cannot measure a coastline definitively, what does that say about measuring the fabric of the universe? Quantum mechanics suggests that at extremely small scales, space itself might be subject to similar uncertainty, with no fixed, absolute measurements. In economics and city planning, the paradox has practical consequences. When governments define maritime borders, should they use broad approximations or highly detailed measurements? The choice can influence territorial disputes, shipping lanes, and fishing rights. Even in biology, the concept emerges. The branching structures of lungs, blood vessels, and trees follow fractal patterns, where their true length depends on how closely we examine them. Nature itself seems to resist being neatly measured or confined. So what does the Coastline Paradox ultimately teach us? It reveals that measurement is not an absolute truth, but rather a function of perspective. The closer we look, the more complexity we uncover. It forces us to reconsider whether our attempts to quantify the world are ever truly complete, or if, like the waves against the shore, reality will always slip through our fingers, revealing infinite detail just beyond our reach. Imagine two identical twins, Jill and Jack. One day, Jill boards a spaceship and embarks on a journey to a distant star at nearly the speed of light, while Jack remains on Earth. When Jill eventually returns, something astonishing happens. She is younger than Jack. This is the twin paradox, a mind-bending consequence of Einstein's theory of relativity. It challenges our intuitive understanding of time and forces us to rethink what it means for two events to happen simultaneously. To understand why this happens, we need to explore time dilation, a key prediction of Einstein's special relativity. When an object moves close to the speed of light, time slows down for it relative to a stationary observer. From Jack's perspective on Earth, Jill's clock is ticking more slowly during her journey. If she travels at, say, 90% the speed of light, every second for Jack might feel like only half a second for Jill. So when Jill finally returns, she finds that less time has passed for her than for Jack. Depending on the speed and duration of her journey, Jack may have aged decades, while Jill has only aged a few years. But here's the paradox. From Jill's point of view, it's Jack who is moving relative to her. Shouldn't his clock be the one running slower? Shouldn't Jack be the younger twin when she returns? At first glance, this seems like an irreconcilable contradiction, but the resolution lies in the difference between acceleration and uniform motion. Special relativity states that all motion is relative, except for acceleration. When Jill turns her ship around to head back to Earth, she undergoes acceleration, breaking the symmetry of the situation. Jack remains in an inertial, non-accelerating frame the entire time, while Jill's journey includes a change in velocity. This acceleration is what distinguishes Jill's experience from Jack's, and ensures that, upon reunion, Jill is indeed the younger twin. The twin paradox is not just a thought experiment. It has been experimentally verified. Precise atomic clocks, flown on high-sped aircraft or satellites, have demonstrated measurable time dilation, confirming that time does pass differently at different speeds. But this paradox raises even deeper philosophical questions. If time can stretch and compress depending on motion, what does that say about our everyday experience of time? If we were to set out on a near-light-speed voyage, could we return to an Earth thousands of years older, while we had only experienced a few decades? Could deep space travelers be effectively immortal from the perspective of those left behind? This paradox also ties into the nature of simultaneity. In relativity, two events that seem simultaneous from one perspective might not be from another. This means there is no absolute present that everyone shares. It's all relative, dependent on motion and gravity. Even beyond physics, the implications are profound. In a universe where time is not a fixed constant, but a flexible, malleable dimension, how do we define concepts like aging, memory, and history? If time itself is relative, what else about our perception of reality might be an illusion? So the next time you check your watch, consider this. Every second you experience is just one version of time's passage. Move fast enough, and you might just escape time's grasp. At least, from someone else's point of view. Imagine a single grain of sand, harmless, insignificant. Place another beside it, then another, and another. At what point does this tiny collection of grains become a heap? If you keep adding grains, it's undeniable that you'll eventually have a pile. But here's the problem. If a heap is made by adding one grain at a time, which exact grain transforms it from a non-heap to a heap? This is the Sorites Paradox, an ancient problem of logic that challenges our understanding of vague concepts. The paradox originates from the Greek word soros, meaning heap, and was first proposed by the philosopher Eubulides over 2,000 years ago. It's deceptively simple. If one grain of sand is not a heap, and adding a single grain can't logically be the defining moment when a heap forms, then, by that reasoning, no matter how many grains you add, a heap should never form. Yet we know intuitively that it does. So where does our reasoning go wrong? The paradox hinges on the problem of vagueness. Many everyday concepts, like heap, bald, tall, or even rich, lack precise boundaries. If you gradually remove hairs from someone's head, when do they become bald? If you take dollars from a millionaire, at what point are they no longer rich? The lack of a sharp cutoff makes it impossible to define these terms without falling into paradox. Philosophers and logicians have explored different ways to resolve the Sorites Paradox. One approach is fuzzy logic, which suggests that truth can exist on a spectrum rather than being strictly binary. Instead of saying a person is either bald or not, we could assign a degree of baldness, allowing for a gradual transition rather than a sudden change. This mirrors how we intuitively perceive concepts in everyday life. Another approach is supervaluationism, which argues that while vague terms may not have strict boundaries, we can still use them meaningfully as long as they hold consistent meaning within a given context. Essentially, language works despite vagueness because we collectively understand its approximate meaning, even if no single defining point exists. But the paradox doesn't just apply to language. It reflects deeper truths about identity and change. Think of a person's life. Over years, cells in the human body die and regenerate. By adulthood, nearly every cell in your body has been replaced from when you were a child. If you are made of entirely different material than you were years ago, are you still the same person? Or consider cultures and societies. Traditions evolve, languages shift, cities are rebuilt, and yet we still refer to them as continuous entities. Is Rome today the same Rome as in ancient times? How much can a city change before it becomes something entirely different? The Sorites Paradox forces us to confront a fundamental problem in human thought: our reliance on imprecise definitions. It exposes the fragility of concepts we take for granted, showing that many of the categories we use are not as rigid as they seem. And yet we navigate the world with these vague concepts every day, using them to make decisions, form relationships, and understand our reality. Perhaps the real lesson of the Sorites Paradox is not that our concepts are flawed, but that our world is inherently fluid. Identity, change, and classification are not always governed by hard boundaries, but by gradual transitions. And while logic may struggle with vagueness, human intuition thrives within it, allowing us to find meaning even when definitions slip through our fingers. So next time you hear someone call something a heap, or a person bald, or a city ancient, remember, the truth may not be in a single grain, but in the way we choose to see the whole. Imagine a grand hotel with an infinite number of rooms, each occupied by a guest. A traveler arrives at the front desk, asking for a room. The hotel is full. Every single room has a guest. But the manager smiles and says, "No problem, we'll make space for you." This is Hilbert's infinite hotel paradox, a thought experiment devised by mathematician David Hilbert to illustrate the counterintuitive properties of infinity. Unlike a finite hotel, where a full capacity means no vacancies, an infinite hotel can always accommodate more guests, if you know how to rearrange them. The manager simply shifts every guest one room over. The guest in room 1 moves to room 2. The guest in room 2 moves to room 3, and so on. This leaves room 1 vacant for the new traveler. Even though the hotel was full, it still had room. Now let's take it a step further. Suppose a bus carrying infinitely many new guests arrives. How could the hotel fit them all in? The manager again has a trick. Each current guest moves to the room twice their current room number. Room 1 moves to room 2, room 2 moves to room 4, room 3 moves to room 6, etc., freeing up all odd-numbered rooms for the infinite new guests. These examples challenge our everyday understanding of numbers. In a finite world, adding guests to a full hotel is impossible. But in an infinite world, capacity is flexible. A whole infinity can fit inside another infinity. This paradox reveals deep mathematical truths. In set theory, not all infinities are equal. The number of natural numbers, 1, 2, 3, 4, is countably infinite, meaning they can be listed in an ordered sequence. But the number of real numbers, including fractions and irrationals, is an even larger infinity, uncountable. The infinite hotel can accommodate a countable infinity of guests, but if an uncountable infinity arrived, there would be no way to fit them. Beyond mathematics, this paradox has fascinating implications for philosophy and physics. It forces us to question what full really means. Can anything truly be complete if infinity is involved? If space and time are infinite, can we ever say there is no more room for something new? It also applies to the real world in ways we might not expect. Consider the multiverse hypothesis, where an infinite number of universes might exist. If every possibility is played out somewhere, does that mean every event has already happened? Just like the infinite hotel always has room, does the cosmos always have space for another reality? The paradox also has eerie implications for cosmology. If the universe is infinite, does that mean everything that can happen will happen somewhere, infinitely many times? Is our own existence just one room in an endless hotel of possibilities where versions of ourselves exist in every conceivable form? Infinity is a concept we use casually, but Hilbert's Infinite Hotel reminds us that true infinity defies intuition. It's not just a big number, it's an entirely different kind of existence, one where the rules we take for granted no longer apply. And if infinity is real, then perhaps our understanding of space, time, and even reality itself is far from complete. So next time someone tells you there's no room, just remember, it all depends on how you count. Imagine a historian living in the distant future, obsessed with uncovering a long-lost manuscript, an undisputed masterpiece, a work of genius whose original author has been forgotten by time. One day, by some bizarre twist of fate, they stumble upon a time machine. Seizing the opportunity, they travel back in time, locating the manuscript and delivering it to the very person history credits with its discovery. That person then publishes it, ensuring its survival through the ages. But here's the question: who wrote the manuscript? This is the Bootstrap Paradox, a thought experiment that arises in discussions of time travel. It describes a situation in which an object, piece of information, or event loops through time with no clear point of origin. It seemingly exists without ever having been created, an effect without a cause. The paradox gets its name from the phrase, pulling oneself up by one's bootstraps, an old saying that refers to achieving the impossible, much like an object existing without a beginning. The idea has been explored in fiction and philosophy, often raising unsettling questions about causality, free will, and the very nature of time itself. To see the paradox in action, let's tweak our story. Suppose a musician in the year 2200 discovers a beautiful, centuries-old melody recorded in an archive. They memorize it and, wanting to ensure its legacy, use a time machine to travel back to the 1800s, where they teach the piece to a young composer. That composer writes it down, and over the years the melody becomes a timeless classic. Eventually, it is archived and rediscovered by the musician in 2200, who then takes it back in time again. The melody has no origin. It was never composed, only passed around in a self-sustaining loop. But here's where things get even stranger. The Bootstrap Paradox directly challenges the principle of causality, which states that every effect must have a cause. In normal circumstances, events unfold in a chain. A leads to B, which leads to C. But in a causal loop, the chain closes in on itself, like a snake eating its own tail. There's no first link in the chain. The melody was never originally created. It simply exists in an infinite loop. This paradox also has implications for identity and authorship. If a work of art, an invention, or a discovery has no clear creator, who rightfully owns it? If an idea is retrieved from the future and introduced into the past, then does the concept of originality even hold meaning? Some theorists attempt to resolve the paradox by suggesting that information and objects caught in these loops exist as closed time-like curves, permitted by the laws of general relativity. In such a scenario, time travel itself doesn't violate physics, but it does leave us with deeply unsettling philosophical implications. If the universe allows information or objects to exist without an origin, what else might exist in such a way? The paradox extends beyond fiction. It applies to the way history itself unfolds. Cultures pass down traditions, stories, and customs over generations. But if the original source of a particular idea is forgotten, does that idea lose meaning? What happens when an entire civilization's knowledge is built upon self-referencing structures, each reinforcing the other without a clear beginning? Perhaps the most profound question the Bootstrap Paradox raises is this: if something has no beginning, does it even truly exist? Or is it merely an illusion, a trick of time's relentless loop, forever cycling through the corridors of history with no one to claim its origin? A crocodile snatches a child from a riverbank. The desperate parent begs for the child's return. The crocodile, however, is not just any reptile. It speaks, and it poses a challenge. If you can correctly predict whether I will return your child, I will give them back. If you are wrong, I will keep them. This is the Crocodile Paradox, an ancient logical dilemma that explores the nature of self-referential statements and contradictions in reasoning. At its core, it presents a scenario where logic itself becomes ensnared in a loop, unable to break free. Let's consider the possible responses. If the parent predicts, "You will not return my child," what happens? If the crocodile intended to keep the child, then the prediction was correct, which according to the crocodile's rule means the child should be returned. But if the crocodile follows through and returns the child, then the prediction was false, and by its own rule, the child should not have been returned. The logic collapses in on itself. Alternatively, if the parent predicts, "You will return my child," the paradox still holds. If the prediction is correct, the child must be returned, making the statement true. But if the crocodile intended to return the child, then the prediction was already correct, meaning the crocodile was always bound to do so. However, if the crocodile chooses to keep the child, then the prediction was false, which means the crocodile had no obligation to return them in the first place. Much like the liar paradox, the Crocodile Paradox creates an unsolvable contradiction, a logical snare in which neither outcome can be resolved cleanly. It highlights the issue of self-referential logic, where statements depend on their own truth value to determine their validity. This paradox is an early exploration of a problem that has implications beyond fables. It plays a role in fields like game theory, where strategic decisions depend on predicting the actions of others, and philosophy, where it raises questions about the nature of truth, promises, and obligations. One particularly intriguing aspect is the question of how language and rules shape logic. If the crocodile's rule is inherently contradictory, does that mean it was never valid to begin with? Or does it force us to reconsider how we define logical consistency? Much like other paradoxes, the crocodile's riddle serves as a reminder that human reasoning is not always as airtight as we like to believe. The paradox also has eerie implications when applied to trust and deception. If someone makes a promise based on an unpredictable outcome, can that promise ever hold real weight? The crocodile's challenge echoes dilemmas in real life, where people or institutions make guarantees that may be logically impossible to enforce or verify. Ultimately, the Crocodile Paradox remains a classic example of how language and logic can become entangled. It forces us to confront the limitations of prediction, trust, and truth itself. An ancient puzzle that, much like the crocodile's decision, remains suspended in uncertainty. Imagine staring up at the night sky, a vast expanse filled with billions of stars, each potentially hosting planets, some of which might resemble Earth. Given the sheer scale of the universe, it seems almost inevitable that intelligent life must exist somewhere beyond our world. And yet, despite decades of searching, we find nothing. No alien signals, no interstellar visitors, only silence. This profound contradiction is known as the Fermi Paradox. The paradox is named after physicist Enrico Fermi, who during a casual lunch conversation in 1950 asked a deceptively simple question: where is everybody? Given the high probability of extraterrestrial civilizations, why haven't we encountered any evidence of them? The question remains one of the greatest thus unsolved mysteries in science. To understand why this paradox is so compelling, we need to consider the numbers. The Eddy-Drake equation. Formulated by Frank Drake in 1961, attempts to estimate the number of active, communicative extraterrestrial civilizations in our galaxy. By factoring in variables such as the rate of star formation, the fraction of stars with planets, the likelihood of those planets developing life, and the chances of that life evolving into intelligent beings capable of communication. The equation suggests that there should be many as advanced civilizations in the Milky Way alone, and yet we detect nothing. There are several possible explanations for this great silence. One theory is that intelligent life is incredibly rare. While microbial life may be common, the leap from simple organisms to technologically advanced civilizations might be a nearly impossible feat. This idea, known as the Great Filter, suggests that, at some point in the evolutionary timeline, there's a nearly insurmountable barrier that prevents life from progressing further. The terrifying question is, have we already passed the Great Filter, or is it still ahead of us? If the filter is behind us, perhaps in the form of the incredibly unlikely emergence of intelligent life, then we may be one of the first advanced civilizations. But if the filter lies ahead, then perhaps most civilizations inevitably destroy themselves before reaching interstellar capability. Another possibility is that advanced civilizations are deliberately avoiding us. Some propose that there could be a sort of intergalactic zoo hypothesis, where extraterrestrials observe us from a distance but choose not to make contact, much like scientists observing wildlife without interfering. Alternatively, the dark forest theory, inspired by Liu Cixin's The Three-Body Problem. suggests that the universe is a hostile place where civilizations stay silent out of fear. If advanced beings recognize that other civilizations could pose a threat, they may choose to remain undetectable lest they attract the attention of a predatory species. Perhaps the answer is more mundane. We might be looking in the wrong way, or not long enough. Human technology has only been capable of detecting extraterrestrial signals for about a century, an infinitesimally short time on the cosmic scale. Civilizations might communicate using methods beyond our current understanding, such as quantum entanglement or signals embedded in dark matter. Or perhaps they exist in a completely different form, post-biological intelligences, vast machine civilizations, or beings so unlike us that we fail to recognize their presence. There's also the unsettling possibility that civilizations arise and vanish too quickly to overlap. If technological societies self-destruct through war, environmental collapse, or uncontrolled artificial intelligence, then the reason for the silence might be that civilizations simply do not last long enough to make contact with one another. Beyond science, the Fermi Paradox forces us to confront deep philosophical and existential questions. If we are truly alone, what does that mean for our role in the universe? Are we the first good intelligent species, the stewards of something precious and rare? Or are we simply one of many, unnoticed and insignificant in a cosmic ocean of advanced beings? If we do find evidence of extraterrestrial intelligence, how would that change our perception of ourselves, our religions, our philosophies, and our future? For now, the Fermi Paradox remains an open question, a mystery that stretches beyond the limits of our knowledge. It is a puzzle that forces us to reconsider not just the possibility of life elsewhere, but our own place in the vast, silent cosmos. Imagine a man who receives a cryptic note warning him to avoid a particular street on a given day. Curious but cautious, he heeds the warning and stays away. Later, he learns that a tragic accident occurred at that exact location. Grateful for the anonymous tip, he goes on with his life. But years later, through a strange twist of fate, he finds himself in possession of the very same note, one that he now realizes he must send to his younger self. This is the essence of the Predestination Paradox, a loop where cause and effect blur, and events appear to be set in stone by their very occurrence. The Predestination Paradox arises in time travel scenarios where an event in the past is caused by actions taken in the future, forming a closed causal loop. It suggests that time is self-consistent and immutable, raising profound questions about free will, determinism, and the nature of time itself. One of the most famous examples of this paradox appears in science fiction. Imagine a man who travels back in time and through a series of circumstances ends up becoming his own grandfather. Or consider a time traveler who gives Shakespeare a copy of Hamlet, and the young playwright transcribes it, taking credit for the masterpiece. But if Shakespeare never wrote Hamlet in the first place, then where did the play originate? This mind-bending scenario is sometimes called the Bootstrap Paradox, where information or objects have no clear point of creation. They simply exist within an endless loop. At its core, the Predestination Paradox challenges our fundamental understanding of cause and effect. We tend to think of time as linear, moving from past to present to future. But in a predestination loop, the future causes the past just as much as the past causes the future. This raises unsettling questions. Do time travelers have free will? Can they change anything, or are they simply playing out an inevitable sequence of events? Some interpretations of time travel suggest that reality enforces self-consistency. That is, events will always unfold in a way that preserves the timeline. If someone tries to change history, the universe might subtly intervene to prevent paradoxes. This idea aligns with the Novikov self-consistency principle, which proposes that any action taken by a time traveler was always part of history to begin with, meaning true paradoxes are impossible. But what does this mean for free will? If time travelers are merely acting out a script already written by their future selves, can they ever truly make choices? Or are they bound to a fate they cannot escape? The paradox suggests a deterministic universe where events unfold in a rigid structure that cannot be altered, regardless of intention. Beyond time travel, the Predestination Paradox serves as a philosophical metaphor. Consider the way historical events shape the future. Leaders inspired by past revolutions go on to lead new ones. Scientific discoveries build upon prior knowledge, and ideas travel through time in a way that makes their origins difficult to pinpoint. How much of history is predetermined by the conditions that came before it? Even in our own lives, we might experience a version of this paradox. Imagine you meet someone who gives you crucial advice that changes your life. Years later, you encounter a younger version of that person, and without realizing it, you give them the same advice, completing the cycle. While this isn't literal time travel, it echoes the unsettling circularity of the paradox. Was that wisdom ever truly created, or was it always destined to be passed along? The Predestination Paradox forces us to confront deep questions about causality, choice, and the flow of time. If events are truly predestined, do our choices matter? Are we just passengers on a pre-written timeline, or do we have the power to break free from the loop? And if reality enforces consistency, does that mean we are all playing roles in a cosmic script that we can never truly rewrite? Perhaps the answer lies not in resolving the paradox, but in embracing the mystery. Time, like the paradox itself, may be far more complex than we can comprehend. A vast, interconnected web where past, present, and future are entangled in ways we have yet to fully understand. Imagine a scientist in a laboratory examining a set of black ravens. Every raven she observes reinforces the idea that all ravens are black. But then she glances at a seemingly unrelated object, a green apple. According to a peculiar principle of logic, this apple somehow provides evidence for the claim that all ravens are black. This counterintuitive result is at the heart of the Raven Paradox, a logical conundrum that challenges how we think about scientific reasoning, confirmation, and evidence. The paradox, first proposed by Carl Gustav Hempel in the 1940s, stems from an application of the equivalence principle in logic. According to basic reasoning, the statement, "all ravens are black," is logically equivalent to "everything that is not black is not a raven." This means that if you observe a green apple, a non-black object that is not a raven, you have technically gathered supporting evidence for the original statement. But does this make any sense? At first glance, the paradox seems absurd. How could a green apple tell us anything about ravens? The problem arises because, in classical logic, any observation that does not contradict a universal rule is considered to confirm it. In other words, every piece of non-contradictory data strengthens our belief in a hypothesis. But in practice, scientists would never take such an approach seriously. After all, you could collect an infinite number of objects that aren't black ravens without actually learning anything meaningful about ravens themselves. This paradox exposes a deeper issue in inductive reasoning, the process by which we generalize from specific observations. If we see 1,000 black ravens, we might conclude that all ravens are black. But no matter how many we observe, can we ever truly confirm the rule? Or are we merely accumulating evidence without definitive proof? And does observing things unrelated to ravens, like apples, genuinely contribute to our understanding? Some philosophers argue that the paradox highlights the limitations of confirmation theory. Hempel himself maintained that, in a strict logical sense, the reasoning holds. However, critics point out that real-world scientific reasoning relies not only on logic, but also on relevance and practicality. A single counterexample, a white raven, would be far more valuable in testing the hypothesis than millions of black ones. This aligns with Karl Popper's falsification principle, which suggests that science progresses not by confirming theories, but by actively seeking to disprove them. But the Raven paradox does not just apply to scientific logic. It raises broader philosophical questions about how we gather and interpret evidence in everyday life. Are we subconsciously reinforcing our beliefs by only paying attention to supporting data? This cognitive bias, known as confirmation bias, is widespread in human thinking. People tend to seek out information that aligns with their existing beliefs and ignore contradictory evidence, much like collecting only black ravens, while disregarding the possibility of a white one. The paradox also forces us to reconsider the very nature of knowledge. If we define truth through accumulated observations, do we risk accepting flawed conclusions? Does evidence have meaning in isolation, or does its significance depend on context? And how can we ensure that our reasoning is grounded not just in logical formality, but in practical reality? Ultimately, the Raven Paradox serves as a reminder that logic and intuition do not always align. It reveals the complexities in how we confirm knowledge and challenges us to refine our understanding of evidence. While we may never fully resolve the paradox, grappling with it brings us closer to understanding the intricate dance between reasoning, perception, and truth. Imagine two groups of patients in a hospital. In one group, a new treatment is given, and their recovery rate appears higher. In another group, the treatment isn't administered, and they recover at a lower rate. On the surface, this suggests the treatment works. But when you break the groups down further, by age, gender, or another factor, you suddenly see the opposite. Within every subgroup, those who received the treatment actually fared worse. How is this possible? Welcome to Simpson's Paradox, a strange and counterintuitive phenomenon in statistics that reveals how trends can reverse depending on how data is grouped. First described by Edward H. Simpson in 1951, this paradox occurs when a relationship between two variables appears in several groups but disappears, or even reverses, when the groups are combined. It highlights the hidden influence of confounding variables, unseen factors that skew our interpretation of data. In simple terms, the way data is categorized can dramatically change the conclusion we draw from it. To illustrate, let's consider an example from university admissions. Suppose a university is accused of gender bias because overall, Fewer women are accepted compared to men. But upon closer inspection, when admissions are examined by department, it turns out that within each department, women actually have a higher acceptance rate than men. How can both statements be true? The answer lies in the distribution of applications. Perhaps more women applied to highly competitive departments with lower acceptance rates overall, while men applied to less competitive ones. The initial conclusion was misleading because it ignored an important factor. This paradox challenges our intuition about how data should behave. We naturally assume that if something is true for individual groups, it must also be true with those groups are combined. But Simpson's paradox shows that real-world data is often more deceptive. In fields like medicine, economics, and social sciences, failing to account for it can lead to misguided decisions. A medical treatment that seems effective in general might actually be harmful when analyzed by different age groups. A hiring policy that appears fair might, in reality, disadvantage a certain demographic when the numbers are broken down. Beyond statistics, Simpson's paradox also has deep philosophical implications about truth and perception. If the same data can tell two conflicting stories, what does it mean to say something is true? It forces us to ask, how do we decide which perspective is the correct one? Is truth something objective, or is it shaped by how we choose to frame information? In many ways, this paradox mirrors the way we interpret the world. Our brains naturally group things together to form patterns, but those patterns can be deceptive. Much like in psychology's cognitive biases, we often fall into the trap of accepting surface-level trends without digging deeper. Are we making decisions based on misleading generalizations? Are we considering the full picture before drawing conclusions? At its core, Simpson's paradox is a stark warning against oversimplification. It reminds us that data doesn't always speak for itself. It must be carefully examined, questioned, and understood in context. As we navigate an era where statistics influence everything from public policy to personal choices, understanding this paradox isn't just an exercise in logic, it's a crucial tool in the pursuit of truth. Imagine you are part of an experiment. A researcher tells you that on Monday, they will put you to sleep and then wake you up. But there's a twist. If a fair coin lands on heads, they will wake you up only once, on Monday. If it lands on tails, they will wake you up twice, on Monday, and then again on Tuesday. However, in both cases, they erase your memory between awakenings. So when you wake up, you have no recollection of whether it's Monday or Tuesday. Now, when you do wake up, you are asked a simple question. What is the probability that the coin landed on heads? Welcome to the Sleeping Beauty Paradox, a mind-bending thought experiment that challenges our understanding of probability and self-awareness. At first glance, you might think the answer is simple. The coin is fair, so shouldn't the probability of heads just be 50%? That's what many assume at first, but upon closer examination, things become far more complex. The key issue is that when you wake up, you don't know whether it's your first or second awakening, if the coin landed on tails. This means that from your perspective, you experience the world differently than an outside observer who sees the entire experiment unfold. This paradox was introduced by philosopher Adam Elga in 2000, and it has led to two major competing interpretations: the halfers and the thirders. The halfers argue that since the coin is fair, the probability of heads should remain 50%. To them, Sleeping Beauty gains no new information upon waking. She already knew in advance that she would be woken up at least once. Since nothing fundamentally changes, the probability should remain unchanged. The thirders, however, take a different approach. They argue that since there are 3 possible awakenings, 1 if heads and 2 if tails, Sleeping Beauty should assign equal probability to each of these events. Since only 1 of the 3 cases corresponds to heads, the probability of heads should be 1/3. This paradox is more than just a quirky probability puzzle. It has deep implications for philosophy, mathematics, and even decision theory. It challenges our notions of what it means to gain information and how we update our beliefs. It also ties into broader debates in probability, such as the difference between classical probability, based on frequencies, and subjective probability, based on belief updating. The Sleeping Beauty paradox also raises philosophical questions about self-awareness and identity. If your memory is erased between awakenings, does each instance of waking up count as a separate experience? What does it mean to be you if you have no recollection of previous events? In many ways, this paradox parallels real-world dilemmas about memory, consciousness, and identity over time. Some have even connected the paradox to cosmology and the nature of existence in discussions about the many worlds interpretation of quantum mechanics. Some argue that we, like Sleeping Beauty, might be living in a reality where our subjective experience differs from an objective observer's view of the universe. At its core, the Sleeping Beauty paradox forces us to rethink probability, identity, and what it means to know something. It challenges our intuition about reality and highlights how fragile our understanding of certainty really is. Whether you side with the halfers or the thirders, one thing is clear. The paradox proves that even the simplest questions can lead us down the deepest philosophical rabbit holes. Imagine you enter a lottery where millions of people each buy a ticket, but only one will win. You know the odds. Your chances of winning are astronomically low. Based on this, it seems rational to believe that you will not win. But here's the problem. If everyone in the lottery follows this same reasoning, then it seems rational to conclude that no one will win, which is clearly false. This is the lottery paradox, a perplexing problem in epistemology that challenges our understanding of rational belief and probability. The paradox was first introduced by philosopher Henry Kaiberg in 1961, and it arises from a conflict between 3 seemingly reasonable principles. 1. High probability justifies belief. If something is highly probable, it is reasonable to believe it. 2. Rational beliefs should be consistent. If you believe something, you should not also believe its opposite. 3. Someone must win. Even though it is reasonable to believe that each individual will lose, we know that one of them must win. These principles seem sensible on their own, but together they lead to contradiction. If it is rational to believe that each ticket will lose, then we must also believe that all tickets will lose, which contradicts the fact that one of them will win. So which of these principles must be rejected? Philosophers have proposed several possible resolutions. Some argue that our standard for rational belief must be stricter. We should only believe something when it is certain, not just probable. Others suggest that we should accept that rational beliefs can sometimes be inconsistent and that probability-based beliefs do not always behave like absolute truths. Another approach suggests rethinking the nature of belief itself. Instead of treating beliefs as binary, either true or false, some argue that belief should be considered in degrees. You can be more confident that you won't win the lottery, but not absolutely certain. This allows us to maintain a more flexible and probabilistic view of belief. Beyond philosophy, the lottery paradox has real-world implications. It relates to problems in law, science, and decision-making. In court cases, for example, statistical evidence alone is often considered insufficient for conviction, even if it strongly suggests guilt. Why? Because courts recognize that high probability is not the same as certainty, just as in the lottery paradox. It also connects to the problem of induction, the philosophical issue of whether we can justify believing in patterns based on past experience. Just because the sun has risen every day in history, does that mean it will rise tomorrow? Rational belief, it seems, is not always as straightforward as we think. The lottery paradox forces us to confront the limits of rationality. What does it mean to have a justified belief? Should we treat probability and certainty differently? And in a world where we constantly make decisions based on uncertainty, how do we balance logic with practicality? On a deeper level, this paradox raises an unsettling question. How much of our knowledge is built on assumptions we take for granted? If we can be so easily misled by reasoning that appears logical, how many other beliefs might be based on flawed foundations? In many ways, the lottery paradox is a reflection of life itself. We constantly weigh probabilities in everything we do, from choosing careers to making personal decisions. We act as though we know the outcome, yet we are always living in uncertainty. Much like the paradox itself, these questions remain unresolved. But they remind us that the way we think about probability and belief is more fragile than we might assume. The next time you buy a lottery ticket, consider this. While it's rational to believe you won't win, you might just become the exception that proves the rule. Imagine you are standing at the starting line of a race. The finish line is ahead, but before you can reach it, you must first get halfway there. Once you reach that halfway point, you must again travel half of the remaining distance, and then half again and again, infinitely. If you must always cover half of the remaining distance, how can you ever actually reach the finish line? This is the Dichotomy Paradox, one of the many paradoxes formulated by the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea in the 5th century BCE. At first glance, this paradox seems absurd. Of course, runners complete races all the time, and objects reach their destinations without issue. Yet Zeno's reasoning, when taken step by step, suggests that motion itself is an illusion, because to reach any point, one must first reach the halfway point, and there are an infinite number of these halfway points to cross. The paradox arises from the idea of infinite divisibility. Space and time, Zeno argued, can be infinitely divided. If this is true, then motion should require completing an infinite sequence of tasks, each of which takes time. How then can anything move at all? Shouldn't an infinite number of steps take an infinite amount of time? Mathematicians and philosophers have debated the Dichotomy Paradox for centuries, and the resolution didn't come until the development of calculus in the 17th century by Isaac Newton and Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz. The key lies in the concept of converging infinite series. While there are infinitely many steps in Zeno's argument, the total distance and time can still be finite. If you sum up the infinite series 1/2 plus 1/4 plus 1/8 plus 1/16 plus, it approaches but never exceeds 1. This shows that an infinite number of progressively smaller steps can add up to a finite value, resolving the apparent contradiction. However, the paradox still raises deep philosophical and conceptual questions. It forces us to reconsider our understanding of continuity, space, and time. Are space and time truly continuous, or are they made of indivisible, discrete units? If the latter is true, does motion occur in tiny jumps rather than smooth progressions? Modern physics provides intriguing perspectives. In quantum mechanics, space and time might not be infinitely divisible after all. There could be a smallest possible unit, known as the Planck length. If reality is fundamentally granular, then Zeno's paradoxes might not apply at the most fundamental level. Similarly, in relativity, motion and time are not absolute, but depend on the observer's frame of reference, challenging the assumptions that underpin the paradox. The Dichotomy Paradox also has real-world implications beyond pure mathematics and philosophy. It plays a role in computational theory, where algorithms that continuously divide problems into smaller steps must ultimately reach a solution. It appears in discussions about artificial intelligence, where systems must process infinite possibilities in finite time. Even in economics, ideas related to diminishing returns and infinitely small increments of utility echo the principles behind Zeno's reasoning. But perhaps the most profound implication of the paradox is its reflection of human experience. We often set goals for ourselves, only to find new challenges emerging at every halfway point. Progress can feel infinite, and just when we think we're close to completion, new obstacles arise. Does this mean that true completion is impossible? Or does it simply mean that life itself is an infinite journey of incremental progress? Zeno's Dichotomy Paradox may have been mathematically resolved, but its deeper philosophical implications continue to resonate. It reminds us that reality is often more complex than it appears, and that even the most fundamental aspects of existence, motion, time, and space, can lead to paradoxes that challenge the limits of human understanding. So the next time you take a step forward, consider this. Are you truly moving toward your destination, or are you just crossing an infinite number of halfway points on an endless journey? Imagine you are presented with two boxes. Box A is transparent and contains $1,000. Box B is opaque and could contain either nothing or $1 million. You are given a choice. Take both boxes, or take only Box B. Before you choose, you are told that a highly advanced, almost infallible predictor has already decided what's in Box B based on what it predicted you would do. If it predicted you would take both boxes, it left Box B empty. If it predicted you would take only Box B, it placed $1 million inside. This is Newcomb's paradox, a thought experiment devised by physicist William Newcomb and made famous by philosopher Robert Nozick in the 1960s. At first glance, the decision seems simple. Why not take both boxes? After all, the money inside Box B is already there, or it isn't, regardless of what you do now. But here's where the paradox arises. The predictor has been right in nearly every case before. If you take both boxes, you're likely to find Box B empty. If you take only Box B, history suggests you will find $1 million inside. The paradox creates a clash between two fundamental decision theories: causal decision theory, CDT. This approach argues that your decision cannot retroactively change what's inside box B. Since the contents are already determined, you should take both boxes to maximize your guaranteed winnings. In the worst case, you walk away with $1,000. In the best case, you get $1,001,000. Evidential decision theory, EDT. This perspective suggests that your choice is evidence of what the predictor has already determined. If almost everyone who takes only box B gets $1 million, then taking only box B is the rational decision. This paradox forces us to confront deep questions about free will, determinism, and prediction. If the predictor is truly infallible, then it suggests your future actions are already determined. But if you have free will, shouldn't you be able to defy the prediction? The paradox also relates to ideas in quantum mechanics and physics. Some interpretations of quantum mechanics, like the many worlds interpretation, suggest that both choices exist in parallel realities. In one reality, you take both boxes and get $1,000. In another, you take only box B and get $1 million. Could it be that your decision collapses reality into one of these outcomes? In real-world applications, versions of Newcomb's paradox appear in AI and game theory. If an advanced AI can predict human behavior with near certainty, how should humans respond? Similar dilemmas arise in economics, where investors' actions are influenced by predictive market trends, potentially creating self-fulfilling prophecies. Even in law enforcement, predictive algorithms attempt to anticipate crime, leading to ethical debates about preemptive action. Beyond its theoretical implications, Newcomb's paradox reflects an everyday dilemma. Do we trust in patterns and predictions, or do we act based on immediate logic? If life itself operates on causality, our choices are just links in a predetermined chain. But if free will exists, then perhaps we can break from prediction and carve our own paths. So if you were standing in front of these two boxes, what would you choose? Would you take both and risk disappointment, or take only one and trust in something greater? Perhaps the real paradox isn't about boxes at all. It's about the nature of choice itself. Imagine a family has 2 children. You learn that at least one of them is a boy. What is the probability that the other child is also a boy? At first glance, the answer seems obvious. Shouldn't it be 50%? However, as you dig deeper, a paradox emerges. This is the boy or girl paradox, a probability puzzle that challenges our intuitive understanding of randomness and statistics. It comes in different variations, but at its core, it revolves around how information affects probability calculations. To see why this problem is deceptive, let's break it down mathematically. Suppose each child is equally likely to be a boy or a girl, independent of their sibling. That gives us 4 equally likely possibilities for a 2-child family. Older child is a boy, younger child is a boy, BB. Older child is a boy, younger child is a girl, BG. Older child is a girl, younger child is a boy, GB. Older child is a girl, younger child is a girl, GG. Each of these outcomes occurs with a probability of 25%. However, we've been given new information. At least one of the children is a boy. This rules out the GG case, leaving us with 3 remaining possibilities, BB, BG, and GB. Since all of these are equally likely, we count how many of them have a second boy. Only BB fits this condition. Since there are 3 remaining possibilities and only one is BB, the probability of both children being boys is 1/3. or about 33.3%, not 50% as intuition might suggest. But the paradox doesn't stop there. A different phrasing of the problem can completely change the answer. Suppose you meet a father on the street, and he tells you he has 2 children, and one of them is a boy named Jack. What is the probability that the other child is also a boy? Here, the result depends on whether the father randomly picked a child to mention, or specifically mentioned Jack because he is a boy. The nuances of how the information is given can alter the probability entirely. This paradox highlights the importance of conditional probability, how the likelihood of an event changes once new information is introduced. It also connects to real-world applications, such as medical testing, where knowing a test result can dramatically change the probability of having a disease. The same statistical reasoning plays a role in fields like machine learning, economics, and even forensic science. The boy or girl paradox also raises deeper philosophical questions. Do we truly understand probability, or do our brains default to instinctual but incorrect reasoning? It challenges our perception of certainty, randomness, and how we process incomplete information. At its core, this paradox reminds us that probability is not just about numbers, it's about how information shapes reality. And sometimes, what seems like a simple question can unravel into a mind-bending journey through logic itself. Imagine being trapped in a situation where every possible choice leads to the same unavoidable outcome. A paradox where the very conditions for escape prevent you from ever escaping. This is the essence of Catch-22, a term popularized by Joseph Heller's novel of the same name. But at its core, Catch-22 is more than just a literary device. It's a profound paradox that reflects the absurdity of self-contradictory rules and no-win scenarios in real life. The paradox is simple. Imagine a soldier who wants to be discharged from duty because they believe the war is dangerous. According to military regulations, they can be deemed unfit for combat if they are insane. However, the very act of applying for discharge due to the danger of war proves that they are sane, because only a rational person would fear for their life. Therefore, they must continue fighting. This circular logic ensures that there is no possible escape from the situation. At its heart, Catch-22 exposes a fundamental contradiction in logic, a rule that makes its own fulfillment impossible. It is a paradox where the conditions for a solution prevent the solution from ever occurring. We encounter similar paradoxes in bureaucratic red tape, workplace policies, and legal systems. For example, job seekers are often told that they need experience to get a job, but they can't get experience without first having a job. The requirement cancels itself out, creating an endless loop. Philosophically, Catch-22 raises questions about autonomy, free will, and institutional control. How often do we accept self-contradictory rules simply because they are presented as the norm? Are we truly making choices, or are we trapped within a framework that only gives the illusion of choice? Mathematically, Catch-22 resembles problems in game theory and logic, where certain conditions are impossible to satisfy simultaneously. In economics, paradoxical loops can emerge in supply and demand cycles, where certain actions cancel out their intended effects. In artificial intelligence, similar paradoxes arise in programming loops that prevent a system from ever reaching a resolution. The paradox also has deep psychological implications. The feeling of being trapped in a catch-22 can lead to frustration, helplessness, and anxiety. It reflects the broader existential question of whether we are truly free or simply following predetermined patterns dictated by larger systems. This paradox applies to society as well. Think about laws that require government-issued identification to access essential services, yet those without an address or identification cannot obtain the very documents they need. The cycle perpetuates itself, making escape from the system nearly impossible for some individuals. Similarly, certain policies claim to help the disadvantaged, but include requirements that exclude the very people they are supposed to assist. Ultimately, Catch-22 is more than just a fictional dilemma. It's a reflection of the paradoxes we encounter in life. It forces us to question how rules are structured and whether we blindly accept contradictions without challenging them. So how often do we find ourselves trapped in our own catch-22s? And is there ever truly a way out? Imagine a being so powerful that it can do anything, create worlds, destroy galaxies, bend reality at will. But then comes the question, can this being create a stone so heavy that it cannot lift it? If it can, then there is something it cannot do. Lift the stone. If it cannot, then there is something it cannot do. Create the stone. Either way, the being is not truly omnipotent. This is the essence of the Omnipotence Paradox, a thought experiment that challenges the very nature of unlimited power. At first glance, the paradox seems like little more than a linguistic trick, a clever play on words designed to trip up the idea of an all-powerful entity. But at its core, it exposes deep contradictions in logic, theology, and philosophy. If omnipotence means being able to do anything, then the very existence of a limit, even a self-imposed one, suggests that omnipotence is inherently self-defeating. One response to this paradox is to redefine omnipotence. Some argue that an omnipotent being is not bound by logic and can do the logically impossible. But does this mean that 2 + 2 could equal 5 in such a reality? If logic itself can be broken, then words and meanings become unstable and reasoning collapses. Others suggest that omnipotence does not mean the ability to do the impossible, but rather the ability to do anything that is logically coherent. In this view, asking whether an omnipotent being can create an unliftable stone is like asking if it can make a square circle. It is not a failure of power, but a failure of language. The Omnipotence Paradox has profound theological implications. Many religious traditions describe deities as all-powerful. But if true omnipotence is self-contradictory, what does this mean for those beliefs? Some scholars argue that omnipotence must be understood in a limited sense. An all-powerful being may have the ability to do anything that aligns with its nature, rather than absolute power without constraint. This perspective preserves divine power while avoiding paradoxes. Beyond theology, the Omnipotence Paradox raises questions about power and control in everyday life. Consider governments, corporations, or individuals who seek absolute authority. The more power one amasses, the more constraints emerge. Leaders face responsibilities that limit their choices. Corporations grow so large they become inefficient, and total control often leads to instability rather than strength. In this sense, the paradox is not just about gods, but about the very nature of authority and influence. Mathematically and logically, the Omnipotence Paradox is akin to Gödel's incompleteness theorems, which show that in any sufficiently complex system, There will always be statements that are true but unprovable. If omnipotence is a logical system, then it may contain its own limits by necessity. Even in physics, there are parallels. Consider the idea of an unstoppable force meeting an immovable object, another paradoxical clash of absolute conditions. The laws of physics place constraints on even the most powerful forces in the universe, just as logical structures place constraints on omnipotence. The paradox also has implications for artificial intelligence. If we were to create an AI so advanced that it could rewrite its own code and evolve indefinitely, would it eventually reach a point where it encounters its own logical limitations? Would ultimate intelligence eventually loop back into contradiction, just as omnipotence does? Ultimately, the Omnipotence Paradox forces us to question the nature of power, logic, and limits. It suggests that true omnipotence, if it exists, may not fit within the framework of human reason. And perhaps in our quest to understand power, whether divine, political, or personal, we must accept that some questions remain paradoxical. So is omnipotence possible? Or is the very concept an illusion, a riddle with no true answer? Imagine a shape so paradoxical that it defies common sense, an object that has an infinite surface area, yet a finite volume. This is Gabriel's horn, a mathematical oddity that emerges from the world of calculus and challenges our intuition about infinity. Gabriel's horn is formed by taking the graph of the function f of x equals 1 over x for x greater than or equal to 1, and rotating it around the x-axis. The resulting three-dimensional shape extends infinitely in the positive x direction, tapering down to an infinitely long, ever-narrowing tube. Despite stretching into infinity, Gabriel's horn has a surprising property. While its surface area is infinite, its volume is finite. At first glance, this seems impossible. If the surface area is infinite, shouldn't the volume also be infinite? The paradox arises because of how calculus handles infinity. When we calculate the volume using integration, we find that it converges to a finite number, specifically p. This means that if you were to fill Gabriel's horn with paint, you would need only a finite amount to do so. But here's the twist. If you then tried to paint its outer surface, you would need an infinite amount of paint, since the surface area does not converge to a finite value. This contradiction forces us to rethink how we understand space and measurement. If an infinite surface can be enclosed within a finite volume, what does that mean for our understanding of physical reality? Could something similar exist in the real world? Gabriel's horn also has implications beyond pure mathematics. It touches on philosophical debates about infinity and the limits of human intuition. How can something be contained if its boundary is immeasurable? Can we trust our instincts when dealing with infinity, or does mathematics reveal truths that defy our everyday experience? Physicists have drawn parallels between Gabriel's horn and certain problems in quantum mechanics and general relativity, where infinities often appear in equations. Black holes, for example, involve singularities, points of infinite density, where our current understanding of physics breaks down. Could infinite surface area and finite volume have real-world analogs in the fabric of space-time? The paradox also has a humorous side. If Gabriel's horn existed in reality, you could fill it up with a small amount of paint, but you could never completely cover it. Imagine a sculptor trying to make one, pouring in paint and watching it fill up completely. only to find that painting the outside would take an eternity. Even in everyday life, we encounter echoes of Gabriel's horn in situations where our expectations of scale and proportion break down. Consider fractals, geometric patterns that exhibit infinite complexity within finite boundaries. The Coastline Paradox, which reveals how measuring a shoreline's length depends on the scale of measurement, also shares similarities with Gabriel's horn. Both expose the strange ways that infinity manifests in mathematical structures. But beyond the mathematics, Gabriel's horn presents a deeper question. How do we reconcile the finite with the infinite? If something as fundamental as volume and surface area can behave in such a counterintuitive way, what other aspects of reality might be equally deceptive? Our perception of the universe is shaped by limitations of our senses, of our cognition, and of the tools we use to measure it. If a simple equation can produce an object that challenges our very understanding of space, then perhaps our reality is more intricate than we can ever truly comprehend. Ultimately, Gabriel's horn is a testament to the beauty and strangeness of mathematics. It reminds us that infinity is not just an abstract concept, but a reality that challenges our perceptions of space, volume, and measurement. It shows that even something as fundamental as filling or painting an object can become paradoxical when infinity is involved. And so the question remains, if an object can be finite and infinite at the same time, what else might we be misunderstanding about the universe? Imagine a lie so paradoxical that it defies logic itself, one that cannot be true or false without contradicting itself. This is the Pinocchio Paradox, a self-referential statement that challenges our understanding of truth and falsehood. The paradox arises when Pinocchio, the wooden puppet whose nose grows whenever he tells a lie, utters the sentence, "My nose will grow now." The contradiction becomes immediate. If the statement is true, then his nose should grow. But his nose only grows when he tells a lie. This means that the statement must be false. But if the statement is false, then his nose should not grow. However, that would mean that he is lying, which should cause his nose to grow, after all. This infinite loop of logical contradiction places the Pinocchio Paradox among the ranks of famous self-referential paradoxes, like the Liar Paradox, where a person states, "This statement is false." If the statement is true, then it must be false. But if it is false, then it must be true. The Pinocchio Paradox is unique, however, because it involves an external, physical consequence, his nose growing, which directly impacts the truth of the statement in real time. This paradox raises fundamental questions about logic and self-reference. Can truth exist in a system where statements can alter reality? If Pinocchio's statement is both true and false simultaneously, does that mean our binary understanding of truth is flawed? Could there be statements that exist outside of traditional logic, neither fully true nor fully false? Beyond fairy tales, the Pinocchio Paradox has deeper implications. Self-referential paradoxes appear in philosophy, linguistics, and even computer science. For example, in programming, certain conditions can create infinite loops, where a program gets stuck repeatedly checking a rule that contradicts itself. In artificial intelligence, self-referential logic can create conflicts in decision-making models. In real life, we see echoes of the Pinocchio Paradox in legal loopholes and paradoxical rules. Consider a law that states, "This law must not be followed. If you follow it, you break it. If you break it, you follow it." Such paradoxes reveal the limits of rigid logical systems, and force us to reconsider how we define truth in different contexts. Some philosophers argue that the Pinocchio Paradox exposes a flaw in our reasoning rather than in reality itself. Perhaps the problem lies in our insistence on absolute truth values, rather than accepting that some statements exist in a gray area, neither fully true nor fully false. Quantum mechanics, for instance, introduces the concept of superposition, where a particle can exist in multiple states at once until observed. Could truth itself work in a similar way? Ultimately, the Pinocchio Paradox serves as more than just an amusing riddle. It forces us to confront the very nature of language, logic, and truth. If a single sentence from a wooden puppet can unravel our understanding of reality, what else might be waiting to challenge the way we see the world? Imagine walking into a room full of strangers and being told that at least two of you share the same birthday. Your instinct might be to doubt it. After all, there are 365 days in a year, and surely birthdays are spread out enough to make that unlikely. But mathematically, this situation is far more probable than it seems. This is the birthday paradox, a counterintuitive probability phenomenon that challenges our natural understanding of chance and coincidence. At its core, the birthday paradox demonstrates that in a group of just 23 people, the probability of at least two individuals sharing the same birthday is an astonishing 50%. Increase the group to 57 people, and the probability jumps to 99%. This seems absurd at first. How can the odds be so high with such a relatively small group? The key lies in how we think about probability. Most people mistakenly frame the problem in terms of their own birthday matching someone else's. However, the paradox doesn't focus on any one specific birthday. It considers all possible pairs within the group. In a room of 23 people, there are 253 unique pairs of birthdays, each with a chance to match. With so many comparisons happening at once, the likelihood of at least one match becomes surprisingly high. To put it another way, imagine flipping a coin. The chance of getting heads twice in a row is just 25%. But if you flip it 253 times, the probability of getting at least one double heads outcome is overwhelmingly high. The birthday paradox follows a similar principle. As the number of interactions grows, so does the chance of a match. Beyond a mathematical curiosity, the birthday paradox has real-world applications. Cryptography, for instance, relies on the difficulty of finding specific matches in vast data sets. But the paradox reveals that collisions, unexpected matches, are far more likely than intuition suggests. This principle is used in designing secure hash functions, ensuring passwords and encryption keys remain difficult to predict. The paradox also applies in genetics, where it helps scientists understand the probability of shared DNA markers among populations. In epidemiology, it assists in modeling how diseases spread within groups. Even in online security, where digital fingerprints and file checksums must remain unique, the birthday paradox warns us that accidental duplicates occur more frequently than expected. But beyond its practical uses, the birthday paradox forces us to confront how flawed our intuition about probability truly is. We often underestimate the power of exponential growth and interconnectedness. Just as in the paradox, where a small number of people leads to a surprisingly high probability of a shared birthday, many real-world systems behave in non-linear ways. where small changes lead to massive effects. And then comes the deeper, more philosophical question. If coincidences like shared birthdays are far more common than we think, how many of our so-called rare experiences are actually inevitable? When you meet someone with an eerily similar past, or stumble upon a book that answers exactly the question you've been wondering about, is it truly fate, or just another instance of hidden probability at work? Ultimately, the birthday paradox is more than just a fun statistical quirk. It's a reminder that the world is far less random than it appears, and that patterns, coincidences, and improbable events might not be so improbable after all. Imagine you are given 2 envelopes, each containing some amount of money. You are told that one envelope has twice as much as the other. You randomly pick one, open it, and see, for example, $100 inside. Then comes the question, should you switch envelopes or keep the one you have? Welcome to the 2 envelopes paradox, a deceptively simple yet deeply perplexing problem that challenges our understanding of probability and decision-making. At first glance, switching seems like a 50-50 choice. After all, there are only 2 envelopes. But let's apply some reasoning. If your envelope contains $100, the other envelope must contain either $50 or $200. Now, if you switch, you have a 50% chance of doubling your money and a 50% chance of halving it. The expected value calculation seems to favor switching. If the other envelope contains $50, you lose $50. If the other envelope contains $200, you gain $100. Since these probabilities appear equal, the expected value of switching seems to be 0.5 times $100, $50, plus 0.5 times $200 equals $125, which is more than the $100 you started with. This suggests that you should always switch. But if that were true, then switching again would also seem beneficial, leading to an infinite loop of irrational decision-making. Where did the logic go wrong? One of the core problems is how we assign probabilities to the amounts inside the envelopes. The paradox assumes that the probability of the other envelope containing half or double the money is always 50%. But that's not necessarily true. The distribution of possible values plays a crucial role. If we do not know how the amounts were chosen in the first place, then treating them as symmetrical, one being always half or double the other, is misleading. This assumption creates an illusion of an advantage where there isn't one. Mathematicians have proposed several resolutions. One approach is to consider the prior probability distribution, how the amounts in the envelopes were initially determined. If there's a fixed maximum amount that could be placed in an envelope, then switching does not always yield a consistent advantage. Another perspective suggests that because the problem is framed in an ambiguous way, it creates an illusion of expected value gain that doesn't exist in a properly formulated probability space. But beyond the mathematics, the 2 envelopes paradox reflects a much deeper philosophical and psychological dilemma. How do we make rational decisions when faced with uncertainty? This paradox forces us to question our own instincts about risk and reward. Much like the famous Monty Hall problem, where intuition misleads us into making the wrong choice, the 2 envelopes paradox exposes flaws in our understanding of probability and expected outcomes. The implications stretch into economics and game theory. Imagine an investor deciding between two stocks. One might double in value while the other might lose half its worth. The reasoning behind the two envelopes paradox mirrors the kind of irrational financial decisions people make when they misinterpret risk. It highlights why investors sometimes jump between assets unnecessarily, thinking they're maximizing returns when they may just be caught in an endless loop of indecision. More broadly, the paradox ties into decision theory and uncertainty in real life. If we cannot definitively assign probabilities to our choices, should we still switch? Should we second-guess every decision, or sometimes accept the uncertainty? And if switching always seems beneficial, is it possible that our framing of the problem itself is flawed? Ultimately, the two envelopes paradox serves as a humbling reminder of the limits of intuition. It exposes the ways in which logical reasoning, when misapplied, can lead to paradoxes that defy common sense. While it might not offer a simple answer, it leaves us with a crucial question. When faced with uncertainty, should we always try to switch to something seemingly better? Or is the real paradox that we might just be overthinking it all? Imagine a donkey standing precisely between two identical piles of hay. Both are the same distance away, both equally fresh, and both equally appealing. The donkey, unable to decide which pile to eat from, starves to death, not because of a lack of food, but because of an inability to make a rational choice. This is Buridan's ass, a philosophical paradox that exposes the limits of logic, decision-making, and free will. At its core, the paradox raises a fundamental question. What happens when a perfectly rational being is confronted with two absolutely equal choices? If there is no difference between the two options, then how can any rational criteria be used to choose one over the other? Buridan's ass suggests that in such cases, the individual would be trapped in perpetual indecision, leading to inaction. The paradox originates from the work of the 14th century philosopher Jean Buridan, though ironically, he never actually proposed this exact scenario. Instead, Buridan explored the idea of determinism and free will, questioning whether humans, or rational agents, truly have the ability to act freely, or whether their actions are governed by external causality. The image of the starving donkey was later attributed to him as a way of illustrating the absurd consequences of strict rationality. At first glance, this paradox might seem like a simple thought experiment, but it has profound implications for philosophy, economics, and even artificial intelligence. If a rational being cannot act without a decisive factor pushing it one way or another, does this mean that pure rationality is insufficient for survival? Does true decision-making require randomness, emotion, or some external force to break the tie? Modern interpretations of the paradox extend beyond just a donkey and two hay piles. Imagine standing in a supermarket aisle, faced with two nearly identical brands of cereal. If they have the same price, the same ingredients, and you have no prior preference, which do you choose? Or consider an online shopper staring at two identical products with identical reviews. Does their choice come down to a subconscious impulse rather than logic? This highlights an important insight. In many real-world cases, our decisions are not always based on pure rationality, but on biases, instinct, or external nudges. This paradox also has direct applications in artificial intelligence and decision theory. If an AI system is programmed to act purely rationally, How does it handle situations where two choices are perfectly balanced? Without some form of tie-breaking mechanism, an AI could theoretically become trapped in infinite indecision, unable to act. This is why modern AI incorporates elements of randomization or secondary preferences to ensure it can still function when faced with seemingly equal choices. The paradox even applies in the realm of economics and game theory. Businesses often face two competing strategies that seem equally viable. Governments struggle to allocate resources between two equally urgent needs. Investors hesitate between two equally risky stocks. In each case, pure logic alone may not be enough to make a choice, and external factors, like intuition, chance, or even arbitrary deadlines, often push the decision forward. One of the most fascinating aspects of Buridan's ass is how it ties into free will and determinism. If we believe that every action we take must have a cause, then when faced with two perfect options, shouldn't we be unable to choose at all? But in reality, we do make choices, often arbitrarily, based on gut feeling, social influence, or even sheer randomness. Does this mean that human decision-making is less rational than we assume? Or does it suggest that true free will might involve an element of unpredictability? So how do we escape the fate of the donkey? One possible solution is acknowledging that no two choices are ever truly identical. Even in cases where options appear equal, there are almost always subtle differences. A fraction of a second's hesitation, an unconscious bias, a minuscule variation in experience. Another solution is to introduce randomness. In the real world, we often make arbitrary decisions simply because we have to keep moving forward. We flip a coin, follow a whim, or allow outside circumstances to tip the scales. Ultimately, Buridan's ass is more than just a paradox. It's a mirror reflecting the complexities of human decision-making. It forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps pure rationality isn't the ultimate tool for survival. Perhaps in order to truly function, we need intuition, randomness, or even irrationality to help us break the ties of endless deliberation. And maybe, just maybe, the key to moving forward isn't always about finding the perfect choice, but about choosing before it's too late. Imagine declaring that tomorrow will be opposite day, a day where everything means the opposite of what is said. If someone tells you it's raining, it actually means the sun is shining. If they say, "I'm happy," they must be sad. But here's the paradox. If tomorrow is truly opposite day, then when you say, "Tomorrow is opposite day," does that statement itself get reversed? If the declaration is true, then tomorrow must be a normal day, contradicting the original claim. This is the opposite day paradox, a mind-bending linguistic and logical puzzle that demonstrates how self-referential statements can lead to contradictions, much like the liar paradox, where a statement like, "This sentence is false," collapses under its own weight. Opposite day presents an issue where language and meaning become unstable the moment they attempt to define themselves. At its core, the paradox arises from self-reference and negation. If language has an agreed-upon meaning, and opposite day forces every statement to mean its opposite, then any attempt to state that opposite day exists contradicts itself. The phrase, "Tomorrow is opposite day," inherently erases itself because on that day, statements must mean the reverse of their intended meaning. This leads to a logical loop in which the meaning of the statement cannot stabilize. The paradox might seem like a playful thought experiment. but it has deeper implications in logic, philosophy, and even artificial intelligence. How does meaning remain stable when the very rules governing meaning are in flux? Consider a more practical version of opposite day. If a society collectively agreed that all laws meant the opposite of their wording for one day, how would governance function? Would no parking signs mean parking is allowed? Would crimes be rewarded instead of punished? The instability caused by such a reversal would lead to chaos, showing that meaning relies on consistency. This paradox also raises questions about communication and human perception. Words only have meaning because of shared understanding. If that agreement is suddenly upended, language itself falls apart. Children often playfully invoke opposite day as a way to tease one another, but as soon as one person declares it, the others can challenge the idea using the same logic. If today is opposite day, then you must be lying about it. The infinite regress of contradictions highlights the fragility of meaning when forced into paradoxical conditions. Even in artificial intelligence and computer programming, opposite day presents a fascinating challenge. AI models rely on logical structures to interpret language, but if every input were forced to mean its opposite, a system would require a stable baseline to interpret meaning accurately. This suggests that for communication, whether between humans or machines, to function, there must always be a foundation of fixed truth. Otherwise, interpretation collapses into an endless loop of reversals. Opposite day is also relevant in philosophy and epistemology, the study of knowledge. If everything we say or believe could suddenly mean the opposite, how can we ever be sure that our understanding of reality is accurate? It forces us to consider whether truth is absolute or context-dependent. This idea extends into real-world scenarios. Political doublespeak, propaganda, and misinformation often operate by subtly distorting meaning, creating an effect eerily similar to an imposed opposite day. So how do we resolve the paradox? The simplest answer is that opposite day cannot logically exist in a formalized sense. The moment you declare it, you undermine its validity. The paradox demonstrates a broader principle. For a system of meaning to function, it must contain unshakable anchors of truth. Without them, the entire structure collapses into incoherence. In the end, opposite day is more than a fun childhood game. It's a linguistic and philosophical experiment that forces us to grapple with the very nature of meaning. It reminds us that while language can be playful and flexible, it ultimately relies on shared understanding. And perhaps the true lesson of opposite day is that meaning itself isn't just in the words we use, but in our agreement to understand them the same way, something that paradoxically, opposite day refuses to allow. Imagine a world where every action you take has already been determined, where your choices are illusions, and your fate is sealed before you even make a decision. This is the heart of the free will paradox, a thought experiment that challenges our deepest intuitions about autonomy and determinism. At its core, the paradox arises from the clash between determinism and free will. Determinism is the idea that every event, including human actions, is the inevitable consequence of prior events and natural laws. If this is true, then every decision you make was already set in motion long before you were born. On the other hand, free will suggests that humans have genuine agency, that we are the authors of our choices and could have acted differently under identical circumstances. but can both be true at the same time. One of the most famous illustrations of this paradox comes from Laplace's demon, a hypothetical intelligence that, given complete knowledge of the universe's current state and the laws of physics, could predict the future with absolute certainty. If such a being could exist, then free will is an illusion. We are merely playing out a script written by the fundamental forces of nature. Yet our subjective experience tells us otherwise. When we choose between coffee or tea, or decide to take a different route home, we feel as though we are actively making choices. But is this just a trick of the mind? Neuroscientific studies suggest that our brains may initiate decisions before we are consciously aware of them, implying that what we perceive as free will is actually a post hoc rationalization of predetermined neural processes. But the paradox deepens. Suppose we embrace determinism and accept that all choices are preordained. What does that mean for morality and responsibility? If a criminal had no real choice in committing a crime, can they truly be held accountable? Some philosophers argue that compatibilism offers a middle ground, the idea that free will and determinism are not mutually exclusive. According to this view, even if our choices are influenced by prior causes, we can still be held responsible as long as our actions align with our internal desires and reasoning. On the other side, hard determinists reject this notion, claiming that true moral responsibility is impossible in a deterministic universe. If everything is causally linked to the past, then punishing someone for a crime is no different than blaming a rock for rolling down a hill. This paradox extends beyond philosophy and into physics and quantum mechanics. Classical physics operates under deterministic principles, but quantum mechanics introduces probability and randomness at the fundamental level of reality. Some argue that quantum indeterminacy leaves room for free will, but does randomness truly equate to freedom? If our actions were dictated by chance rather than deterministic laws, that still wouldn't grant us meaningful control over our choices. The free will paradox also seeps into theology and metaphysics. Many religious traditions grapple with the tension between divine omniscience and human agency. If an all-knowing deity already foresees the future, do humans truly have the power to make different choices? Some argue that divine foreknowledge doesn't necessarily imply predestination, while others see an unavoidable conflict between omniscience and free will. So is there a resolution? Some suggest that free will is an emergent property, not an illusion, but a complex phenomenon that arises from deterministic processes. Others believe that we must simply redefine our understanding of choice, seeing it not as an unrestricted ability to do anything, but as a nuanced interplay between cause and effect. In the end, the free will paradox forces us to confront the limits of human understanding. Are we the masters of our fate, or merely passengers on a predetermined path? Perhaps the true answer lies not in solving the paradox, but in recognizing that even questioning it is an exercise of our own supposed free will. Imagine a race between the mighty warrior Achilles and a humble tortoise. Achilles, being much faster, allows the tortoise a small head start. But as Achilles begins to chase, a strange thing happens. Every time he reaches the point where the tortoise was, the tortoise has moved a little farther ahead. No matter how fast Achilles runs, he can never quite catch up. This is Zeno's Achilles and the Tortoise Paradox, one of the most famous paradoxes in the history of philosophy and mathematics. At first glance, the paradox seems absurd. Of course, Achilles will overtake the tortoise. Yet Zeno's reasoning appears flawless. The core of the paradox lies in the division of space and time into infinitely smaller segments. Achilles must reach the tortoise's starting position first, then the next position, then the next, and so on. Since there are infinitely many points he must pass, how can he ever finish the task? If an infinite number of steps is required, shouldn't Achilles be trapped in an endless chase? Zeno's paradox challenges our understanding of motion and the very nature of infinity. It suggests that movement is impossible because it requires completing an infinite sequence of actions. This contradiction troubled mathematicians and philosophers for centuries, raising fundamental questions about the nature of space, time, and continuity. One possible resolution comes from calculus, developed centuries later by Newton and Leibniz. The concept of limits allows us to sum an infinite series of smaller and smaller distances to reach a finite result. In this framework, Achilles does indeed catch the tortoise, because although the number of steps is infinite, the total time required is finite. This mathematical breakthrough provides a logical resolution, yet the paradox still raises deeper questions about how we conceptualize infinity and motion. Beyond mathematics, the paradox has profound philosophical implications. It forces us to ask, is the world continuous, or is it made up of discrete steps? If space and time are infinitely divisible, does this mean we can never truly move from one point to another? Modern physics, particularly quantum mechanics, complicates the matter further by suggesting that on the smallest scales, space and time may not be continuous at all. The paradox also serves as a metaphor for real-world struggles. How often do we set goals, only to find new obstacles appearing just as we make progress? It mirrors the way progress in life, technology, and science often feels like an infinite chase, where each solution brings new challenges. Ultimately, the Achilles and the Tortoise paradox continues to captivate minds across disciplines, from philosophy to physics to computer science. It reminds us that even seemingly simple concepts, like motion and progress, can unravel into profound and unsettling mysteries. And so, like Achilles, we keep running, not just toward the finish line, but toward a deeper understanding of the infinite complexities of reality. Imagine a list of all interesting numbers, numbers that stand out due to some special property. Perhaps they are prime, perfect squares, or hold significance in mathematics or nature. Now imagine defining an interesting number as any number that has some unique property worth noting. But here's the paradox. If such a list exists, then there must also be a number that is the smallest uninteresting number. Yet the moment we identify this number, it suddenly becomes interesting by virtue of being the smallest uninteresting number. And so paradoxically, no number can truly be uninteresting. This is the interesting number paradox, a mind-bending paradox that arises from self-reference and the nature of classification. Much like the liar paradox, where a statement contradicts itself, or the Sorites Paradox, where gradual change creates uncertainty in categorization, this paradox reveals how definitions can unravel under scrutiny. At its core, the paradox exploits a contradiction in our reasoning about properties. If interesting numbers are a well-defined category, then there must exist numbers that do not belong. But the mere act of defining an uninteresting number contradicts itself, because we have just made it interesting. The paradox plays on the ambiguity of language and classification. What exactly makes a number interesting? Some numbers, like 1, 2, and 3, are clearly significant for fundamental mathematical reasons. Others, like 1729, are famous due to historical anecdotes. Srinivasa Ramanujan identified it as the smallest number expressible as the sum of two cubes in two different ways. But what about 89 or 5023? They may not seem remarkable at first, but they likely have hidden properties that would make them interesting upon deeper examination. This paradox isn't just a clever word game. It has implications in mathematical logic and artificial intelligence. In programming and database structures, categorizing objects requires clear-cut rules. But if the boundary between categories shifts based on the act of labeling itself, how can we define absolute properties? This issue extends into machine learning and AI, where algorithms attempt to classify data, but can struggle when definitions rely on context or human interpretation. The paradox also touches on philosophy and human perception. What makes something interesting? Is it an objective quality, or is it entirely subjective? If interest is defined socially, by what mathematicians or scientists consider noteworthy, then our standards for what is interesting evolve over time. This suggests that categories we think of as fixed may be more fluid than they appear. Even in epistemology, the study of knowledge, this paradox raises deep questions. How do we classify concepts when defining a category can alter its meaning? It mirrors real-world issues in science and linguistics, where defining new terms can shift how we perceive and organize information. Consider the classification of species in biology, where drawing a boundary between one species and another can be surprisingly difficult due to gradual evolution. So is there a resolution? One approach is to accept that interestingness is inherently subjective and context-dependent. Another is to formalize definitions mathematically so that a number is only deemed interesting if it meets a specific criterion independent of subjective interpretation. But even this does not eliminate the paradox. It simply shifts it into a new form. In the end, the interesting number paradox is more than just a mathematical curiosity. It's a metaphor for the way we structure knowledge itself. It reveals that categories we assume to be concrete often dissolve under scrutiny, forcing us to rethink how we define, label, and understand the world. Perhaps the real lesson of this paradox is that nothing is truly uninteresting, because even the act of declaring something uninteresting makes it worth discussing. A closed box, a cat, and a vial of poison. With these simple elements, Erwin Schrödinger introduced one of the most mind-bending paradoxes in physics, Schrödinger's cat. It's a thought experiment designed to illustrate the bizarre implications of quantum mechanics, specifically the idea of superposition. Imagine a cat placed inside a sealed box with a radioactive atom, a Geiger counter, and a vial of poison. If the Geiger counter detects radiation from the atom's decay, it shatters the vial, killing the cat. If no radiation is detected, the cat remains alive. The catch? According to quantum mechanics, until someone opens the box to observe, the atom exists in a superposition, both decayed and undecayed at the same time. And if the atom is in both states simultaneously, so is the cat, both alive and dead. A single observation forces the system to choose one outcome or the other. At first glance, this seems impossible. How can a cat be both alive and dead? Schrödinger himself wasn't proposing that real cats exist in such states. Rather, he wanted to highlight the counterintuitive nature of quantum physics. In the microscopic realm, particles exist in multiple states until measured, but applying this idea to larger, tangible objects like a cat creates a paradox that challenges our understanding of reality. This paradox raises profound questions about measurement and reality. Does observation truly determine the outcome? Is reality itself undefined until we interact with it? The famous Copenhagen interpretation suggests that the act of measurement collapses superposition into a single definite state. But alternative explanations exist, like the many worlds interpretation, which suggests that both realities persist. One universe where the cat lives, and another where it dies. In this view, every quantum event creates a branching of the universe, leading to an infinite multiverse of possibilities. Beyond physics, Schrödinger's cat has become a metaphor for uncertainty in many aspects of life. We often exist in states of indecision, until an action forces a definitive outcome. Think of applying for a job. Until you receive an answer, you exist in a superposition of both hired and rejected. The paradox also relates to free will. Are choices truly ours, or are they the result of an underlying deterministic reality that only collapses when we commit to a path? Schrödinger's cat also intersects with modern technology. Quantum computing, for instance, relies on qubits, which, unlike classical bits, exist in a superposition of 0 and 1. This principle allows quantum computers to perform vast numbers of calculations simultaneously, unlocking computational power far beyond classical systems. The paradox, once a purely philosophical dilemma, now has real-world implications in the forefront of technological innovation. And then there's the question of consciousness. Some interpretations suggest that a conscious observer is required to collapse a quantum state. Does this mean reality only exists because we are here to perceive it? Could the entire universe be in a state of quantum uncertainty without a mind to observe it? The paradox forces us to confront an unsettling idea. Reality may not be as objective as we assume. Instead of existing in a single definite state, it could be a shifting landscape of probabilities, solidifying only when measured. If this is true, then what is real? And what role do we, as observers, play in shaping it? Schrödinger's cat remains one of the most fascinating paradoxes in science and philosophy. It challenges our notions of reality, observation, and existence itself, leaving us with a haunting question. If the universe itself is like the cat in the box, suspended in a state of possibility, then what happens when we finally open the lid? Imagine a world where a major crisis is averted, but no one notices. This is the essence of the Prevention Paradox, a counterintuitive concept that highlights how successful preventative measures can make problems seem non-existent, leading people to question their necessity. At its core, the Prevention Paradox states that an intervention that benefits the population as a whole may seem unnecessary to individuals because they never experience the crisis it prevents. This is especially relevant in public health. Consider vaccines. Widespread immunization prevents outbreaks, but as diseases disappear, skepticism grows. People start to wonder, was the vaccine ever needed? Ironically, the very success of prevention makes its necessity harder to justify. Another classic example is road safety. Traffic regulations, seatbelt laws, speed limits, DUI enforcement drastically reduce accidents. Yet because fewer people see the devastation of unchecked reckless driving, some may argue these laws are too restrictive. When prevention works, the problem fades from view, and skepticism replaces caution. The paradox extends beyond health and safety. Take economic policies. Governments implement regulations to prevent financial collapses, but when crises are avoided, critics claim the measures were excessive. Had the regulations not been in place, economic disaster might have struck. But because they worked, the threat seems imaginary in hindsight. It also manifests in climate action. Policies aimed at reducing carbon emissions prevent environmental disasters. Yet when they succeed, skeptics argue that the crisis was exaggerated. People only react to disasters they experience, making it difficult to maintain support for long-term preventative efforts. But the prevention paradox poses a dilemma. How do you convince people to invest in solutions for problems they don't see? This is a key challenge in fields like medicine, policymaking, and risk management. Should leaders allow small-scale crises to occur so people understand the risks firsthand? Or should they continue preventative measures, knowing that success might lead to complacency and backlash? Philosophically, this paradox raises questions about perception and human psychology. We judge reality based on visible consequences, but what about the disasters that never happened because of prevention? How do we recognize success when it leaves no evidence of what was avoided? It also touches on free will. If we preemptively solve problems, are we truly preventing disaster, or just altering the timeline to one where the crisis never existed? This links to the grandfather paradox. Does preventing an event mean it never had a chance to happen in the first place? The prevention paradox reminds us that the absence of a problem is not proof it never existed. It's often proof that someone, somewhere, took action before it was too late. It forces us to reconsider our assumptions about risk, responsibility, and the unseen forces shaping our lives. And perhaps it leaves us with a deeper question. How many disasters have been erased from history simply because prevention worked so well that no one noticed? Imagine writing a book filled with well-researched, carefully argued chapters. In the preface, you humbly acknowledge that, despite your best efforts, there may be some errors somewhere in the text. But if you believe each individual chapter is accurate, how can you also believe that some part of the book is likely wrong? This is the heart of the Preface Paradox, a philosophical dilemma that challenges how we think about belief, knowledge, and rationality. At first glance, it seems reasonable to believe each statement you make in a book. If you didn't think a chapter was true, you wouldn't have included it. But at the same time, it's also rational to accept that, given the complexity of the material and the possibility of human error, there's a high chance that at least one statement is mistaken. The paradox lies in this contradiction. How can you rationally believe both that all the claims are true and that at least one claim is false? This conflict illustrates a key tension in epistemology, the study of knowledge and belief. The Preface Paradox shows that holding individually rational beliefs can lead to a collectively irrational position. If every chapter is believed to be true, then logically, the whole book should be considered error-free. Yet acknowledging the likelihood of error based on statistical or historical precedent is also a rational stance. The paradox becomes even more pressing when we scale it beyond books. Consider scientific research. Each study is conducted with care, peer review, and rigorous standards. Scientists believe their results are accurate. Yet as a community, scientists also recognize that some studies will be flawed, whether due to experimental error, statistical anomalies, or unrecognized biases. This collective humility is crucial to scientific progress, but it also mirrors the exact structure of the Preface Paradox. A similar situation occurs in our daily lives. We make dozens of assumptions and decisions based on what we believe to be true, about people, plans, predictions, but we also recognize that not everything we believe can be right. So are we being inconsistent, or is this a necessary feature of rational thought? Philosophers have offered several responses. Some suggest embracing a form of probabilistic belief, where instead of treating beliefs as absolute, we assign confidence levels to them. In this view, we might be 95% confident in each individual chapter, but still accept that, across the whole book, there's a high chance at least one error has slipped through. Others argue for a revision of our logical principles, suggesting that it may be acceptable to hold inconsistent beliefs if they each have independent justification. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of consistency and coherence. Should a perfectly rational agent avoid contradictions at all costs? Or is some level of contradiction an unavoidable byproduct of navigating a complex, uncertain world? Some argue that consistency is an idealized model, not a practical requirement for real human reasoning. In politics, journalism, and law, the Preface Paradox plays out subtly but persistently. We expect policymakers to stand firmly by their decisions, yet also to admit when mistakes are made. We expect journalists to report facts with confidence, while acknowledging the possibility of retraction. The balance between conviction and fallibility is delicate, and when handled poorly, it undermines credibility. But when acknowledged honestly, it can foster trust. Philosophically, the Preface Paradox forces us to grapple with the limitations of certainty. It reveals that rational belief isn't always about achieving perfect consistency, but about managing risk, acknowledging fallibility, and striving for truth in an imperfect world. It teaches us that intellectual humility and confidence are not opposites. They are two sides of the same coin. In the end, the Preface Paradox reminds us that knowledge is not a static possession, but a dynamic process. Our beliefs, like the chapters of a book, may each be reasonable and well supported, yet still vulnerable to error. And perhaps the most rational stance is not to avoid paradox, but to embrace it as a sign that we are still learning, still questioning, and still growing in our understanding of the world. Imagine walking into a bar and someone tells you this: there is someone in this bar such that if they are drinking, then everyone in the bar is drinking. At first, the statement sounds absurd. How can the drinking habits of one person determine the behavior of everyone else? This is the heart of the drinker paradox, a logical riddle that challenges how we understand implication and reasoning. The paradox stems from a principle in classical logic known as material implication. In logic, a statement of the form, if A, then B, is considered true in all cases, except when A is true and B is false. That means if A is false, the whole statement is automatically true, regardless of B. This leads to counterintuitive outcomes. Let's break it down. Suppose no one in the bar is drinking. Then the statement is true, because the if part is false. Now suppose at least one person is drinking. We can choose that person as our subject, and if everyone else is also drinking, the statement holds. In either scenario, the logic checks out. This paradox reveals how formal logic can diverge from common sense. Most interpret, if someone drinks, then everyone drinks, as a causal or social claim. But in logic, it's purely structural. Truth-functional logic doesn't always align with intuition. Some philosophers argue paradoxes like this highlight a need for relevance logic, where implications must have meaningful connections. Others suggest the paradox isn't a flaw in logic, but a reminder that logic applied without context can lead to strange conclusions. The paradox has implications in fields like artificial intelligence and law, where systems based purely on logic may produce results that are valid but bizarre from a human perspective. Understanding it helps develop reasoning models that better reflect how people think. What makes the drinker paradox especially striking is how it illustrates the gap between technical validity and perceived meaning. It challenges our expectations by showing that statements can be logically sound, even when they seem completely disconnected from reality. In doing so, it forces us to question the assumptions we carry into conversations, debates, and analysis. It also reminds us that paradoxes aren't just intellectual puzzles. They're doorways into deeper understanding. By engaging with them, we learn to navigate the fine line between precision and absurdity, and we sharpen our ability to reason in a world that doesn't always follow neat, logical rules. Ultimately, the drinker paradox isn't really about drinking. It's about how structure can mask absurdity. It challenges us to ask whether truth lies in the form of statements or in the meaning we attach to them. And in doing so, it reminds us to examine not just our conclusions, but the reasoning that leads us there.